Where does mariachi actually come from, and is it true that it actually has West African roots? Mexican mariachi was built on West African rhythm, indigenous ceremony, and Spanish instruments fused together in western Mexico, especially in Jalisco, Michoacán, Colima, Nayarit, Guerrero, and along the Pacific coast. Most people, when they think about mariachi, they think that it's only Spanish and indigenous, but there is a West African component to this music. To understand mariachi, you have to understand how colonization and slavery in Mexico forced different people into the same world and reshaped everyday life. When Spain invaded the region, it set up a colonial system built on forced labor. From 200,000 to 500,000 West African people were brought into New Spain through the transatlantic slave trade. By the colonial period, people of West African descent formed a significant part of the population in places like Jalisco, Michoacán, Colima, and Nayarit. Within this colonial world, people of West African descent lived alongside indigenous communities and Spanish settlers. Indigenous people were also pulled into the missions, ranches, and agriculture, and under the caste system, they had children with people of West African descent and of Spanish descent. Creating mixed communities, these three cultures fused together and created what we now know as mariachi. Before mariachi had a name, indigenous communities already held ritual gatherings called mitotes. These were communal ceremonies. That is where the fandango emerges. Fandango is a West African diasporic word and practice that arrived in colonial Mexico through African communities formed during the colonial period. In colonial Mexico, the word fandango came to describe a long communal gatherings where people sang, danced, ate, drank, and celebrated together, often for hours or days. So the indigenous ceremonies of the mitote and the West African diasporic fandangos merged together and created this space. When Spanish authorities in colonial Mexico outlawed West African drums, West African rhythms adapted instead of disappearing. West African and Afro-descended communities in Mexico turned their bodies into the instrument. So zapateado developed within this context as a West African diasporic dance form rooted in Mexican colonial life. People raised a wooden platform, the tarima, and used their feet to strike it, keeping complex polyrhythms alive through the movement. In Mexico, zapateado allowed West African rhythms to continue openly, turning dance into percussion and making the floor itself a part of the music. Mariachi originated in western Mexico, especially in Jalisco, Michoacán, Colima, Nayarit, Guerrero, and the Pacific coast. As people from these regions moved from ranching, mining, and agriculture and trade, mariachi moved with them, reaching Alta California, or today's California, while it was still part of Mexico. Communities from these regions continued holding fandangos and mariachi gatherings there as part of community life. What many people recognize today took shape later when mariachi entered radio, film, and national stages. Many famous mariachi singers and icons came to represent the image, even though the music itself grew out of a deeply mixed communities shaped by West African, indigenous, and Spanish life together. So next time you listen to some mariachi, remember that it carries West African roots too. So did you know mariachi also has West African roots?